Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Well, welcome to our third annual Mark Part Peace and Possibility Speaker Series. So this series was started by a generous gift from James County Mark Part with the purpose of bringing together the community to hear prominent LGBTQ leaders talk about their experiences, their achievements, and to hopefully educate us, bring our community together. We are really excited today to be able to welcome back to Weber one of our wonderful alumnus, Wade Davis. As you know, he completed his undergraduate here at Weber State, played for our football team, and then went on to have a professional athletic career that's inspiring. He has come out and engaged in a lot of social advocacy for the betterment of the LGBT community, as well as gender equality. And we were just grateful to have him, so please help me welcome Wade to Weber.
Hello, Weber. Wow, this thing is loud. How are you all doing today?
Great.
Thank you, Jason, for welcoming me here, and thank you all for coming out. It's always a privilege to come back home, and I call Weber my home with great joy. I had a chance to see our new facilities today, and there was a part of me that was extremely envious because I would have been so much better if I had all that stuff, right? Coach Grable won't admit to that, but I'm sure it's true. The second thing is I felt great pride because I know that I played a small role and to help to build that. So I'm going to spend some time talking to you all. So I had a chance to talk to a young student during the breakfast, and they were a gift, and they called me to change my whole speech. So I had a chance to talk to this young person, and they reminded me that even though the world may be a little bit better, that each person's struggle to identify as LGBT is still an individual act, right? That we oftentimes think that the world is so much better, right? And it may be better for the collective, right? But to identify as LGBT is still an individual act. So I'm going to read a poem by a man named Paul Laurence Dunbar. And the poem is called We Wear the Mask. We wear the mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let they only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh the clay is vile beneath our feet and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. When I was playing here at Weber and in the NFL and also in college, I wore a mask. The interesting thing about the idea of the mask is we all wear a mask. I want you all to pause for a moment and think about what mask have you worn throughout your life? What mask have you worn? And how did those masks help you in certain ways? How did those masks, for lack of a better word, how did they discipline you? But also, how did those masks take something from you? Because nothing is one-sided, right? The fact that I was able to play in college, spend some time in the NFL, that mask that I wore in some ways benefited me, right? But what did it take from me? So the title of this series is, sorry, I'll make sure I get this right. is coming out, being included, and living your best life. So let's take all three of those. So I'll be honest, I don't use the language of coming out. Think about it. What does the idea that LGBTQ people come out connote? What is it really saying? It's saying that we're coming out of hiding. The phrase is often, we're coming out of the closet. I never existed in a closet. I was right in front of you the whole time. LGBTQ people do not come out of a closet. What we do is, I'm going to use the language of a friend of mine named Mr. Darnell Moore, we actually invite you in. We invite you in to what's happening here. But we were in front of you the entire time. The question is, what did you all do to make the world safer for us to disclose and to invite you in? Because what exists, when you were a kid, what existed in closets? Any thoughts? Monsters, clothes, wire hangers. LGBTQ people, I'm not scary. I'm not a wire hanger. I'm not a smelly shoe, right? So imagine if those of you who do not identify as LGBT, I said to you that you existed in a closet. Or I even framed the idea of your existence as that you were hiding something. That wouldn't feel very kind or very generative, right? I mean, that feels actually very oppressive. And language matters. Language really, really matters. As an athlete, language mattered a lot to me. Language mattered a lot. So as someone who invited the world in, that felt much more kind. It honored the act of what was actually happening. Because again, I was in front of you all the entire time. We invited you in to what was happening into our personal lives. So I want us to push ourselves when we think about the language that we use. Are we actually affirming the lives of LGBTQ people, or are we actually making a demand on them? And the demand is rooted in the belief that we're being deceitful by not disclosing. We're not being deceitful. You didn't do your work. You didn't do your work to make the world a more equal and equitable place for us to disclose, to invite you in. And we wore the mask to protect ourselves from you. We didn't wear the mask because we woke up one day and said, I'm never going to tell someone who I am. I'm going to keep that to myself forever or for as long as I can. No, we wore the mask out of necessity. Many of us wear our mask out of necessity. When you all think about masks that you have worn, wasn't it out of necessity? It wasn't a choice that you made. It was a survival mechanism. So when we think about LGBTQ people and this idea of coming out, that's not what we do. We invite you in. And we invite you in to our minds, which is actually one of the most dangerous places, because we're trying to reconcile the fact of our you is the world of space where we can be more of ourselves in. We're we're placing a bet. And we're saying that I want to bet that now is the time that the world will not destroy me. That the world will not destroy me. When I first told someone that I was gay, I never said the word gay. The first time I told someone, I said, I like boys. That was safer, because the word gay felt so heavy. It felt like a car on my back, because the word gay came with so many other types of connotations that I didn't put on it, and that I didn't want put on me. So I said, I like boys. And then I got to I don't know if there's a better space, but a different space, where I used to say things like, I'm gay, but I'm not a faggot. Because I was trying to distance myself from something, right? And the word gay, I was a little bit more comfortable getting closer to it, but I didn't want the idea of being a fag put on me. Because I had certain associations associated between, in my mind, there was a difference. There was a distance between being gay and being associated with being a fag. Because a fag was not a man. A fag was someone who allowed things to be done to him. And that wasn't me. I had agency. I had power. I could influence the world. Because that's what, when we use the language of power, what we really mean is the ability to control the destiny of others. That's what power really means. And I felt like I had power. So I didn't want anyone to name me as a fag, so I named it first. And then I matured a little bit because my thinking at that time was extremely infantile. I moved away from the idea that there was any difference between being gay and being a fag. But I had to do that internal work. And the internal work is a fascinating one when we move to the latter part of the title, which is living your best life. How do you live your best life? There's only one way. There's only one way to live your best life, and that's to learn to love yourself. How many of you are parents or guardians in the room? Nice. How many of you as parents have told your kids these exact words? You should love yourself. A lot of you have told your kids that, I would imagine, right? How many of you have taught them how? Different question, right? And when I was a kid, no one really gave me the self-esteem to know that I could love myself. But in order for me to live my best life, in order for me to show up in the world as more of myself, I needed to know who I was. No one ever told me what does it mean to know who you are. No one ever helped me become a critical thinker also, to think critically about the world. You know the best way to teach your kid or someone to be a critical thinker? Teach them to write. Teach them to write. To write about everything. Because when you write more, you have to think. You've got to think. And when you're teaching your kids to write, teach them to write about things that take the other argument. To argue the other side. Because if you can argue the other side, then you actually really know what you believe in. I didn't know what I believed in. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was. The only thing that I knew for sure is that I wasn't going to tell anyone that I was gay. It's the only thing that I was sure of. I didn't even know what I wanted to be. I didn't know who I could become because I didn't see any models. I didn't see any models. I didn't have anyone that actually said the words that I will love you, I will respect you, I will value you, no matter your gender identity or your sexual orientation. How many of you have said those words? How many of you have said out loud, I will love you, I will value you, I will respect you, I will ask questions, I will be curious, regardless of your sexual orientation or your gender identity, regardless of what you choose to do with the rest of your life. Those are the ways that you instill a certain level of trust into your child, and then that child will learn how to trust him or herself. Because no one ever really instilled that in me. So I didn't know how to live my best life. One of the reasons I didn't know how to live my best life is point number 2, is that I didn't always feel included. So what does included mean, all right? We use these words of diversity and inclusion. What do they really actually mean? And what is the root of diversity and inclusion? It's really social justice work. It's civil rights work. That's actually what it is. That's the genius of women. It's the genius of black women. What they did was they said, there's some oppression happening in the corporate space, in the collegiate space, all over this world, and we need to adapt a language that people that'll be palatable. Right? That'll be palatable. So instead of saying we're doing civil rights work in colleges and universities, they said, let's call it diversity and inclusion. They got you. They got you. Because imagine if someone said, hey, in your college and university, we want to do social justice and civil rights work. You'd be like, no, that doesn't fit here. This is an institution for learning. But if someone said, hey, we actually want to make sure that people feel included and that you have different forms of representation inside of your organization, then you go, I can do that. It's all language. Words matter. They shifted the language. But what they're really talking about is discrimination. No lack of access. That's how you know when you're in power. When people have to actually change the language in order to adopt it to fit you. So the idea of being included, so there's a quote by a woman named Renee Myers. And she says, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. I take that a little further. I say inclusion is being actually one of the party planners. Inclusion is actually being able to say, who gets to be invited? Inclusion is about having equal access to power and influence, right? Because we've already defined the word power, right? So I need some of that power. I don't need you to tell me that I can be invited and that I can dance and you get to pick the music and who gets to come to the party. I should have a say-so in that too, right? So inclusion is a little bit different. It's saying that I have some choice in the matter. So how many of you are being thoughtful about making sure that people have choice in the matter, right? Because if you're around a table making a decision, if you're making a decision that impacts more than just you and your family, you need to make sure there's different forms of representation at the table, right? And that doesn't mean that you can have a bunch of different people who are all the same gender, right, who are from different parts of the world. That's certain levels of diversity, but that's not representation. Because imagine that you stay with me. You live in my house. And you pay half the rent. And I get to make decisions for you about when you can eat, when you can sleep, how much of the TV you can watch, all those things, and you're going, hey, I'm paying half of the bills here. I should have equal representation or equal say in what happens, right? That would feel non-inclusive, would it? You wouldn't like that. So why do we do the same things? Why do we make decisions without going, who's not seated at the table? Whose voice is not present here? So how many of you all are being truly thoughtful about being inclusive? How many of you identify as allies in this room? It's one of my least favorite words in the entire world. I'm an ally. Are you sure? You sure? Because the term ally is not a noun. It's a verb. You actually have to do something to be named an ally. You don't get to name yourself an ally. You don't get to say, I care about women's rights. I'm an ally. No one cares. The question is, what are you doing? Ally is a verb. You actually have to make an act. You actually have to give something up. You actually have to give something up. How many of you are willing to give something up for somebody else to feel included? And I really mean give something up. Because when it comes to equity and equality, typically those who have more have to actually give up something for me to have more. Right? If I have 10 apples and you got no apples and you want to eat, I've got to give something up for you to eat. I've got to make a decision. Maybe I can go buy some more apples and give those to you and keep my 10, but I still have to give up something. What are you all willing to give up to ensure that when I invite you in, I feel included, therefore I can live out my best life? That's how it goes. You have to give something up, and only you get to decide what that giving up is. It could be your time, it could be your money, it could be your position, it could be your privilege, because we hate that word privilege, right? We're like, oh, so sick of this word, privilege, 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 privilege. White privilege, male privilege, privilege, straight privilege, oh, privilege. Okay, use a different word, right? So what are you willing to give up? in order for me as an LGBT person to feel more part of this world? What are you willing to give up? Because if you really want to be an ally, you got to give something up. You just can't sit there, right? The question is that you all have to answer in your own silence, what are you willing to sacrifice for someone else to have the opportunity to succeed in this world? And if you're not willing to give something up, I'm okay with that. Just say it. Just say it. It's okay. Because at least I know where I stand. Tell you all a weird story. So when I moved from Louisiana, where I was raised, to Colorado, it was very different. And it was the first time I had been in a white person's house my entire life. And I walked into my friend, his house, and I was like, wow, this house is huge. It's clean. And it smells white. It's my first thought, that the house smelled white. Right? And whenever I tell my white friends that, they have no clue what I'm talking about. But when I tell my black friends that, they go, yes, white people's houses smell really white. Right? So what do I mean? Let's see if we can pick up on what I mean by this. And no people of color can answer this question. What do I mean when I say I went into a white person's house and it smelled white? Come on. Guess. You have to be disinterested in needing to be right.
Different kinds of smells. Things you hadn't experienced before.
Close.
Okay.
What else? Come on.
The pine salt.
No? My people got pine salt. What else?
Candles.
No? My people got candles.
It's just the food smell.
Yes! White people, it doesn't smell like y'all cook. In black people's houses, you're like, man, somebody's fried some bacon at some point ever, some fried chicken, some pork chops, something, right? And I was like, doesn't smell like anyone's ever cooked in here. And I'm sure that they had, right? But that was, honestly, every black person's house smelled like literally some catfish had been frying for hours and it just seeped into the whole place, right? And moving from the south to the north was an education because it got me out of my comfort zone. Because I was living in a very tiny, tiny box. A tiny box, right? What I lacked was proximity. Proximity. How many of you lack proximity to difference? So that when you walk into someone's house, metaphorically you go, smells white. Hope you get the metaphor. How many of you have never spent any real time with someone who identifies as trans? Any real time? How many of you have never spent real time with a book that's a story about someone who identifies as trans? Because you don't have to always engage with someone individually, but reading a memoir is a level of closing down that distance, is a way to get more proximity. How many of you have never spent any real time in a black person's house? Like I had, right? So I just own my stuff. What are you willing to own? What are you willing to give up? Sometimes it's as easy as giving up that. Because again, when I use language of giving up something, I know our minds go to money, right? Or, things. But sometimes it's literally as here. It's just that simple as your mental and emotional power. How many of you have just actually spent time with a memoir? Because what happens is when you close down the distance, you see yourself. You see yourself. Tell you another story. So my partner, he's French. He's a tax lawyer, one of the smartest people I know. And we've been together for about 5 years now. But when we met, I knew probably the third month dating that I wanted to marry him. There's very few things I've ever been clear about. And I was sitting on my couch watching Sex and the City. Don't judge. And I was like, wow, I'm gonna marry him. And it came over me like a tidal wave. And I was like, I can't tell him. Because I knew that the way his brain works, if I told him too soon, he would think I was crazy. One, right? But he would question whether or not I had thought about this a lot. So I waited a couple months, and on my birthday, which is in July, we're sitting on my in my apartment, and I tell him that I love him for the first time. And he looks at me and he says, "Thanks. Don't tell me every day." And I was like taking a bullet. He said, "Thanks. Don't tell me every day." And he looks at me and he can tell that I'm confused at his reaction. And he says, "If you told me you loved me with the expectation that I was going to say I love you back, then you told me for the wrong reason. You told me for you, not for me." And I was like, oh God, he's right. I was expecting him to say it back. But here's the truth. Even though we're maybe walking down the same road, we're experiencing that road differently. Though we were in a relationship, he was experiencing a relationship at a different pace than I was. So could I not have the expectation that he was going to fall in love at a different time than I would? So when he told me, thanks, that's all that he had to offer in that moment. Could I not honor that and respect that and keep the journey going with him? Because the ask when we're in relationship with someone else is not that they're perfect, but is that they stay in it and that they're honest. Could I handle that honesty? Could I handle him telling me, thanks, don't tell me every day though? And then he said to me, he said, well, you Americans say I love you before you go to bed, when you wake up in the morning, after each phone call, after you have a banana. He was like, we don't do that in France. He said, tell me you love me when you feel the exact same way you feel in this moment. Because you gave up something. You gave up something. Every time you tell me you love me, I want you to feel like you're giving up something. Because when I tell you it back, I'm going to be giving up something. And I had to really wrestle with that idea. Because what I did in that moment, because what happens when we enter into any real relationship with another person, guess what we learn? Humility. When you really get close to someone, you learn humility because they become your mirror. He was my mirror in that moment. He mirrored back the fact that I had only told him I loved him for me because I needed to hear him say it back. When you all close down the distance, when you remove the proximity between people who you think you know, but you actually really don't know them, you learn humility. You learn humility. And humility is a gift. Humility is a gift that you do not get in isolation. Because when we're alone, we think our stuff does not stink. We think that we got it. We love to say things like, but I'm a good person. I'm such a good person. What does that even mean? What does that mean when you say, I'm a good person? Here's a secret. No one cares. No one cares what you think of yourself. Like I said, when it comes to being an ally, the question is, what actions are you taking? Goodness is individual. Goodness is individual. You get to decide how good you are to yourself, but I get to decide whether you're actually an ally. I get to decide whether we're existing in solidarity, whether or not you are giving up things to make sure that I have a certain level of safety. Because when you make the demand that LGBTQ people disclose or come out, you better give up something because I'm giving up a lot here. What are you willing to give up? Now, we have this term, living your best life. How many of you are living your best life? How would you know if you haven't defined it? So I do lots of trainings for organizations, specifically groups of men. And toward the middle of the training, I asked them to write down their definition for success. Imagine if I asked you all to write down how you define success. What would you write? Anyone? What's success?
Doing my best every day.
Doing your best every day? Okay. What else?
Knowing I can do more tomorrow because I've prepared myself today.
Love it. Thank you. Others? What's success to you?
Taking care of my home.
Taking care of your home? Okay. What else? I'll let the wine breathe.
That I've helped somebody.
That you've helped someone. Okay. Two more.
Paying off student loans.
Right? Right? One more. What's success? Happiness. Okay? Why didn't anyone say being the CEO of a company? Or having $1 million? Say it. Someone's going to say something.
I said because we're in higher ed.
Very fair, very fair, very fair, right? The reason I ask the question is that if you do not define what living your best life is, if you do not define what success is, then what direction are you going in on your journey? If you've not defined it ahead of time, here's the truth. A lot of us define success in ways that we're afraid to own out loud. Some of us actually would say, I made $10 million, I'm pretty successful. When you watch television, the people who they name successful are typically business people who are wealthy, right? All your definitions were great in this room, but the rest of the world doesn't see that as successful. So how many of us are actually a little bit dishonest about how we think of success? Because we know what we should say out loud, but internally there's a very different answer. How many of us know what we should say, but when the microphone is on you, you go, I know better. I know better. When you're willing to live your best life out loud, you're unafraid. You're willing to take risk. So the last thing I want you to understand, and I'm going to say something dangerous, especially in the collegial space. We have this term, safe spaces. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a safe space. But let's complicate it a little bit. So there are about 50 people in here. Let's say that I gave you all a piece of paper. And I said, write down your definition of safe space. Do you think I would get the exact same need from every person? So how in the world is it possible for me to make this space safe for all of you at the exact same time? It's actually not possible. What I have to potentially do is help you all stand in the circumstance of risk, as Bell Hooks says. How do I get you to stand in the circumstance of risk? Now, some of you do that daily by virtue of your identities. Being LGBT means you stand in a circumstance of risk. Being a person of color means you stand in a circumstance of risk. Being a woman means you stand in a circumstance of risk. Some of us who may not stand in that risk all the time need to give up something. How many of you have ever walked to your car with the key out at night? Right? Those of us who haven't have to figure out, how do we change that? Because we do know that there are certain people who are in more risk than others. So the only way for me to live out my best life is if I do the work to ensure that you can. It's the only way. So James Baldwin has this quote, and I'll leave this all with you, and then we'll move to the Q&A. He said, if they come for you in the morning, they're coming for me at night. If they come for you in the morning, they're going to come for me at night. What that means is that we're in this together. What that means is that your safety cannot be at the risk of my own. What that means is that if you feel unsafe, I have got to give up something to help you ensure certain levels of safety. I've got to do that work. I've got to risk something. I've got to give up more for you to feel comfortable to invite the world in, to be included, and to live out your best life. Thank you all so much for your time. So we got some time for some questions. Let's have a little fun. I said some pretty radical stuff on this stage now, so I'm sure that you all have some questions. I'm sure. Yes, there we go. Pop the top on the...
So, have you always been an incredible public speaker?
So I was raised in a Baptist church, which meant that I was formed in that type of a crucible. So I think that, I'll tell you the truth, watching Sanford and Son and raised in the Black Baptist church has helped me understand how to give a decent talk, right? Just to mix in a little bit of humor, also to say some things that are a little bit challenging, but to also try to engage you all and to move around. Because when you watch a really good comedian, they move, right? Because if I'm standing still the whole entire time, your eyes can get a little tired. But if I'm moving around, I have to keep you engaged. And I also make it a point to say some things that you may not agree with, because I want you to. I want you to challenge me, because when you do that, I know more and you know more. Yeah.
The question that I had to do with how do you reconcile the relationship between your identification and the larger interpretation of the African American spiritual community? So, for example, you say you grew up in the Baptist church.
Oh, yeah.
How do you reconcile your spirituality with the way in which the Black community views LGBT community / someone like yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. No, it makes perfect sense. Here's the truth. The African American community doesn't own a patent on homophobia, right? That homophobia is not more or less in any community. Here's another example. So you can go to certain parts of America right now and you will see anti-sodomy laws on the books. Black people have never been empowered to put any of those laws on the books. We didn't put any of them on there, right? So what that tells me is that homophobia is not a centralizing factor in our lives. Now, there is a tension that exists between the LGBT community and the Black community. And that, in my opinion, that tension is because of the perception that we have been here since 1619, and the gay community just arrived yesterday, right? And they got all these gifts already, right? Whereas we're like, hey, we're still having our right to vote rolled back, right? So there's a tension. Now, what no one wants to talk about is there are Black gay people like me, right? Who sit at this intersection, thank you, our sister Kimberly Crenshaw, right? The challenge is that because there are gay white men who have access to certain levels of capital, to power, right? They can call a meeting with certain people who have power, whereas our community may not have that same level of access, right? So the tension is not about whether the Black community is more or less homophobic than any other one. The tension is, can these two communities see themselves in each other and see their struggle as aligned and not counter, right? Because who do I fight with? The gay community or the Black community? The truth is, I shouldn't have to choose, right? But your question is a real one. So to answer the other question that you asked, I believe God is love. And if God is love, then I'm included in that. And there's no other statement that the Bible says that I take higher than that one.
So have you distanced yourself then from the Black community?
Oh, no.
As a result of your...
No. I've actually, this is going to sound weird to you, I've actually become closer to the Black community because I unlearned the myth that Black people were exceptionally homophobic. When I learned that wasn't true, it actually brought me closer. I've actually become less engaged in the LGBT community because I found out that specifically the white LGBT community hasn't wrestled with their own racism, right? Like there's been a demand made on the Black community to wrestle with this homophobia. That's been a demand that's been made, right? There hasn't been the same demand asked of the LGBT community to wrestle with their racism. And until that happens, I keep a little bit more distance there because I have been loved, I've been embraced, I've been welcomed by far more black people who people would deem homophobic than I have an LGBT community who will say that they love me, but they love the gay part of me, but not the black part of me. Yeah, thank you for that question. Coach Grable's smiling at me. I like that. I mean, that's something decent.
Wait, I am so grateful that you are here. You can't really see me as Adrian.
I can see you. Thank you for showing up.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more about intersectionality and how we can navigate by recognizing intersectionality to create those opportunities to give something in the moments of risk.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't who don't know the term, intersectionality was created by a black woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. It was created because the federal courts did not recognize that black women could be impacted by racism and by sexism. So what happened was this black woman, her name was Emma DeGraffenreid, and she was at, I believe, either the Ford Motor Company or a motor company, and she accused Ford of discriminating against her on the basis of sexism and racism. A judge said to her, if I allow you to sue on the basis of both, I'm giving you a privilege. And I've never known black women to have privileges in my whole life. So the judge said, you can sue on the basis of racism or you can sue on the basis of sexism, but you cannot sue on the basis of both. So what intersectionality really is, it is about systems of power that come together at an intersection and that offer people more forms of oppression, right? Now, we all have different identities, but that doesn't mean that your identities collide to oppress you, right? So you could identify as Irish and you could identify as a man. That doesn't mean that you are oppressed because you're Irish and you're a man. So I want us to just get very clear about what intersectionality is really about first, because it's really important that we don't empty the academic work that Kimberly Crenshaw did, because we love to throw around intersectionality without actually understanding the history of it. So I wanted to ground us in that. And to your question, Adrian, is that we, as I said earlier, have to understand that our struggles are aligned. So as Jason said earlier, I do a lot of work around sexism. Actually, I do more work around sexism than I do around homophobia, because the root of homophobia is sexism. So when you see those two systems of oppression collide, then I make a choice and I go, which one is the root? Which one is the root? And my choice, because I read a lot about this, and I was like, oh, the reason why people hate gay men specifically is because of sexism. You know, and if you read a lot, if you get into the work, you go, oh my God, it makes so much sense. So as we are thinking intersectionally, we have to think the people who we're engaging with, what are the systems of oppression that are colliding at their lives at the exact same time? And then how do I, if one of those oppressions impacts me? So imagine that you are a gay white man. You are sitting under the oppression of homophobia, right? Now, if you meet a trans woman, she may sit under the intersection of sexism, of transphobia, and if she's a woman of color, of racism. You can relate to her because you understand how homophobia and sexism and transphobia collide. So now you can figure out, oh, what can I give up? You can give up your male privilege and have conversations with men. Because here's the truth, when you're trying to undo systems of oppression, you talk to the oppressor, not the oppressed. Right? So a lot of us have conversations with people who agree with us. They already got it. Go talk to people who don't agree with you. And be disinterested in needing to be right when you talk to those people. Because what if you're wrong? Can we actually listen? Can we be curious? Can we ask better questions? Can we be open? Because the truth is, if everybody agreed with you, then you would never learn. You wouldn't learn. So we have to get out of our comfort zone and have conversations with people who we don't agree with, but we have to be disinterested in needing to be right. We have to be disinterested in needing to think of ourselves as good people, because you're not a good person. You are a human being. That is all that you're sure of. There's nothing else that you're sure of. No one is sure that they're white. No one is sure that they're black. No one is sure that you're 100% male. No one is sure you're 100% female. You're not sure of it. You may say you are, but you're not. The only thing that you can be 100% sure of is that you are a human being, because that's all the options that there are. So when you think about what do I need to give up, and how do I need to think about the intersections that I sit at, if you understand the ways that you are oppressed, you can get closer to understand the ways that others are oppressed, and then you can go, oh, if I have a part of me that is privileged, I can use that to undo other forms of oppression. Great question, Adrian. We have a question down front.
Yeah, you talk about the difference between coming out versus letting others in. For you, I would assume there were times when you let individuals in over time, but what was it for either within yourself or within society at large where you felt comfortable enough, or whatever that might be, to allow more in, to allow the world in to Wade Davis versus individual basis, to be who you are more open now?
Yeah. There were 3 primary factors, and I'll try to answer this question quickly. The first is I found a community of people around me who had similar experiences. So I joined the New York Gay Flag Football League, and I was able to play sports with other gay men who I was like, oh, okay, I'm not the only gay guy that likes sports. And we could have conversations that I couldn't have with my other male friends who like sports who were heterosexual, because there's always a distance, right? So that was one, like finding a community gave me one level of like courage. Second one was falling in love, right? Falling in love it's the most dangerous thing you're ever gonna do, honestly. We don't think about it as that, but it actually is. It's very dangerous. So I had another more intimate level of support. The third one, what's probably the most impactful of all 3, was that I took a job at this youth serving LGBTQ organization. And I was working with kids from 12 to 24. And these young kids, many of them were homeless or marginally housed. Many of them were at high risk of HIV and AIDS. Many of them were homeless because they told their parents that they were LGBT. And I had never seen that type of courage in my entire life. I want you to imagine for a second meeting a 12-year-old kid who is homeless, living on the street, using their body to survive only because they wanted to be themselves. I want you to imagine that there's thousands of kids who do that every day. That's courage. Playing in the NFL, playing at Weber was easy compared to what I witnessed those young kids do. I witnessed a young kid who told me that as soon as he told his parents that he was gay, he was out on the street the next day. The next day. And he assumed that that would happen, and he did it anyway. So for me, witnessing that type of, and courage is actually too small of a word. I don't have the vocabulary for what that is. It's actually undescribable. But you know it when you see it. And I needed to use my privilege. I needed to give up something. And part of me giving up something was giving up my safety of being, in the peripheral, being on the outside of the struggle and the fight. So I decided I knew that if I told the world that I was gay, they want to talk to me. They'd want to, and, thankfully I had read enough to not say some stupid things on TV. And I said a couple stupid things, but it was part of my journey, right? But those young kids really were the gasoline. Yeah, thank you for that. Any other questions? Oh, yes, please.
What ignited your passion when you first started exploring critical scholars and reading their types of literature? Like, did you learn about it here or where did that spark up? Where did that passion come from?
This is one of my favorite stories to tell because it doesn't paint me in a good light. So no, there were no gender studies classes at Weber when I was here. I mean, I got a good education here. I had the best economics teacher when I was here. Oh my God, I mean, that class was life-changing. Just to close out that story, the reason why that class was life-changing is that teacher made economics real. You know, and you know, for all of you teachers, when we're a student, we know when you do not believe in us, and we cannot learn from you. Can't learn from you. If you don't believe in us, it's impossible for a kid to learn from you. So, but to be more specific about your question, so at this same LGBTQ organization, and I say this not to be self-deprecating, I was an idiot when I got there, when it came to like all these issues I can speak about now. And I was a director, and there was a woman who I was her boss, in quotes, and she had an opinion about something I didn't agree with, and we had a combative conversation. And I tried to de-escalate her. So I said, "Sweetie, calm down." Exactly. I told you I was an idiot, right? And she looked at me and she said, "Don't ever call me sweetie." And I was like, "But I'm a good person. You know what I mean? You know me. I got women friends." You know, like all the things that we say when we're trying to prove to someone that we're not that thing that we just proved that we are, right? Because I just proved who I was, right? So my supervisor at the time, a woman named Lillian Rivera, who is just a genius, she called me to her office and she was like, "So, I heard what happened between you and Erica." And she said, "Tell me what you think made Erica respond the way that she did to you calling her sweetie." And I went blah, blah, blah. She said, "Great." She reached behind her desk. She grabbed this book by a woman named Bell Hooks, who I had never heard of. And she said, "Read that." The book was entitled Bell Hooks' Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. It's about 200 pages. I go home, I read it, I'm like, got it. Go back to her desk. A couple weeks later, she asks me the exact same question. I give her the exact same answer. She says, "Read it again." And I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" She says, "Yes, read it again." Fine. Book's not that big, right? I go home, I read it the second time. This time I'm sure I got it. I mean, I'm not unintelligent, right? I got it. I go back to her desk. Maybe a couple weeks later, she asks me the exact same question. I give her the exact same answer. And she says, "Read it again." And I'm like, "What do you want me to know?" And she says, "If I tell you, it won't become personal. It won't be personal. So you're going to read this book until you figure it out." The third time I'm reading it, it's about a quarter or halfway through, it dawns on me, this book's about me. It wasn't about women at all. Feminism was not about women at all. Women already knew. You were just trying to give us the language. You were trying to get men to do the emotional labor. And I was like, I don't want to curse, but I was just like, darn. So I go back to her desk and I give her more of me. And it just opened up something inside of me that's unexplainable. And there were other people there who just gave me more books and more books and more books. And at this time, I don't know if you all know who Laverne Cox is and Janet Mock is. They were there the same time that I was there working. So you had like these people who were geniuses at this place at the same time, and they were challenging me and calling me sexist and misogynistic, and I was like, no, but yes, I am. I'm trying to figure it out. It's so hard. And it just, so, and I literally and even to this point now, I don't read books written by men very often. I mean, the last book I've read by a man, I just bought a Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, which I haven't started reading it yet, but so I primarily read books written by women with the intention of learning more about myself when I read it. Right, so I'll be personal for a second. I just finished reading Chanel Miller's book. She was the woman who was raped by the guy at Stanford, and that guy at Stanford only got 6 months of raping her. And during the first 20 pages, she talks intimately what it was like to wake up in the hospital and not know why you're there, but having people talk around the idea that you were raped without actually saying it. And as a man, to understand what it means to have a rape kit put on you is mind-blowing. It changes your whole understanding about the idea that women make these things up. It complicates that narrative in a way that I couldn't understand. So when I read that book, I learned more about myself and other men, in that moment. I also learned that what we don't have to go through, what we as men don't have to go through when there's an accusation of rape. We have to go through some things, but no one is sitting us up in stirrups with our legs wide open going inside of us. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen, right? When you close that distance down, you have a more intimate understanding of what the other is going through. But I also can know what it feels like when someone is trying to get inside here, and I'm trying to protect myself. Because when I was not out, I was constantly trying to protect myself. Chanel Miller couldn't protect herself. There was a hollowing out, and that's her language, of being hollowed out by the act of another human being, right? So when I read books written by women, my goal is to understand, but to find the ways that I'm implicated in it. And that's the hard part, is when you read about someone else's oppression. So if you're a man and you find out the ways that women are oppressed, it's done to benefit you. That's hard to understand what I mean by that. It's really hard to understand that. And it's really hard to understand that even though you may not directly take those benefits, they still exist. And you have to do the work to untangle them. Even though you may not be taking those treats, but those treats are there for you to grab if you want to, or if you don't, they're still there. When I read, I was like, oh my God, look at all those treats for me as a man. They're available, I can take them when I want. Women don't get those treats. So that level of emotional labor, that level of vulnerability is why I read so many books written by women, because I've been a man for 42 years, I kind of got it. I talk to men a lot. I kind of get them a little bit. I didn't understand you. And then what I learned also, a lot of men would disagree with me about this, but it's true when you ask them, we know nothing about your lives, because we don't have to. We don't have to. And if you understand what I mean when I say that, then you've done some work. But if you don't, you should read more. LGBT people know everything about what straight people go through, because we have to. Black people know everything about white people, because we have to. If you can understand what I mean by that, then you've done some really amazing work. If you don't, I wish you luck. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Wade Davis, wonderful speaker, alumnus of Weber State, and someone who does great work. Please join me in just one more round of applause.